John Schotter Day. What a wonderful idea, and I feel so privileged to participate in it, at least in this way. I think of how privileged we are to have John Schotter, such a generous man, a man ahead of his times, as a member of our community. Or should I say, how privileged we are that he has invited us to be his conversation and thinking partners. He is always so challenging and so inspirational. I smile as I talk about him because he has been so influential in the way that I think about my practice, and particularly providing me ways to think about it, to articulate and describe it. In other words, to put words to what I do, and in putting words to what I do and then performing what I do, then influences my own words, the way that I talk and the way that I think about it. Each time I board an airplane, I take at least 2 of John's articles with me. Pages with tattered, torn edges, ink marks, words in the margins, highlighted sentences, and I read them again, as I will read them again in the future, over and over again. There are always all these little jewels that sometimes on the first or the second or the third reading, for some reason, has not caught my attention in the way that it does at a particular moment in time, like on the airplane reading it. Oh, perhaps it's the glass of champagne I have to get started, which might help. Toast to John. So it's the way that he puts words together, the way he does sentences, even though some of his sentences can be 8 or 10 lines long. There's something about the way that he puts words together that invites you to continually think and rethink about them. So, for example, these are quotes from John's writings. A sense of disquiet. Beautiful, a sense of disquiet. And if we try to uproot them from their surroundings to study them elsewhere, their dynamism would be lost. Another one, the dense white darkness of the fog. Now I know this last one, the dense white darkness of the fog, was influenced by the writing of another author. But he uses it, he puts the words together in his own way, which helps you, I think, have an image of what he's talking about. It helps put pictures to the words that make up the idea that he's trying to put forth. He has a remarkable grasp, descriptions, and interpretations of many authors who have influenced his writings and his thinking and his extension and editing of their ideas and works, I will say. Particularly people like Bakhtin, Merleau-Ponty, and Wittgenstein. And then more recently, the writings of Berard, Berthaud, and Lepari. I'm also very struck by his occupation these days with what it is to be a good, or he might say good enough, human being, and also his occupation with beginnings, because I think the two really go hand in hand, and I can very much relate my work and some of the metaphors that I use in my teachings with his focus on being a good human being and how we are in the world, how we take a step and sort of maybe bump into something which influences how we then take a step back or a step to the side or another step forward. He is challenging what one might think of as the traditional discourse in academic psychology, which he has really been doing all of his career as early as the 1960s, which also makes me think of something that connects with what I was just saying, that one of his main critiques is, and I think we all here wholeheartedly agree with him, that mainstream psychology, historically and much of it today, has missed the part of not only being a good human being, but being a human being. And that in our professional arenas, whether it's in a teaching arena or an arena with a client or a patient in a hospital, that we are human beings with each other, and that's the most important thing to keep in mind. Not only how to be a good human being, but how to be a good human being with another human being that is open to the specialness, the uniqueness, the otherness of them and their lives. Okay, so I mentioned that he began his criticism of academic psychology and the psychology discourse in the 1960s. And I was recently reading something of his where he was reiterating something that he wrote in 1975, which is more than 4 decades ago. So I'm just going to read his words to show how tenacious he is in not giving up and finding different ways to talk to his colleagues. He says, "We cannot achieve the kind of understandings of our everyday works that we seek by a recourse to traditional scientific method alone. For example, just by the use of theory of case or theory-driven methods. The reason I gave many years ago, referring to something he wrote in 1975, were that although modern psychology promised to discover our true nature in the experimental laboratories, in fact it only investigated there what happened when people were, or still are, treated as if they are rats, machines, information processors, or some other non-human entity out in our world, around us. While the fact of our being responsible for the creation and sustaining of our human nature as persons," puts that in italics, "within a culture," in italics, "with a long developmental history," in italics, to it. So as persons within a culture with a long developmental history to it, was and still is often ignored. Thus, the idea of us as persons in relation to all the others and otherness around us, capable of creating in our works so many different ways of actualizing and expressing amongst ourselves our humanness, did not seem then to be needed, and often now still does not seem to be needed as a central focus in the so-called mainstream social and behavioral sciences, and I add particularly the discourse of psychology. So what he's challenging, as all of you already understand, is psychology treating people as if they are kinds, types, or categories of people or of problems, and that there are already prescriptive ways, pre-structured ways of interacting with them. And basically, if those pre-structured ways, those recipes, those formulas do not work, then it's not in the formula, it's not in the theory, it's in the person that we're working with, and certainly not in ourselves. So I mentioned in my opening remarks that John is a very generous man, and he really, really is. He came to the International Summer Institute and spent a week with us in 2014 and in 2015. And this year he was not able to come, but he wanted to be there. He had begun and wanted to continue some conversations and to share some of the updates and his ideas since he had met with us last summer. So he volunteered to join us electronically, and so we Zoomed him in. And we offered him and his words as a surprise to the participants. We didn't tell anyone that he would join us because we weren't quite sure that this would happen for many reasons. And we all certainly know that anytime you try to do something electronically, that there are always challenges and gaps that can't be filled in. So he began by saying that there were a number of new themes that he had been thinking about since he was with us the year before. But again, that he was really focused on what it is to be a good human being. And then he was talking about dialogicality and deep dialogicality. And I started thinking about that word deep, because I'm not sure that I connect with that word in terms of going deeper into something. And I think that has to do with traditional discourses in psychology, which mean that to be a successful therapist, to be a successful patient or client, you have to go deep. You have to get them to go deep into, almost deep into the past, deep into the history. So there's certain words that just catch me in a particular way or strike me in a particular way, and that's one of them. But he talked about it as something that comes before participating in dialogue. And again, emphasize that everything said is in response to something that has already been said, and that everyone knows what that is or has some sense of it, not each person knowing in the exact same way, but a sense of it in the way that it makes sense to them. Okay, so a moment ago I was talking about words, and I know that John, in his, I'll say recent writings and talks, has emphasized the importance of using ordinary language, ordinary words, rather than professional language or jargon. And I really like so much, John, that you're trying to do that in your own writing and in your own talking. I noticed particularly when you've been at the Summer Institute that you're talking, your ways of presenting your ideas, that you're using much more kind of everyday, ordinary talk. And I like that, so I have to smile when I say this. You talk about wanting to feel at home with yourself and with others, and that we always kind of wonder how we're going to be, how we're going to talk with the other person sitting in front of us. And I think it's important to remember that you also say, and I agree, that the landmarks, so to speak, are already there. That we don't need to put the landmarks on the map. They're already there, they've already been created. Whether the landmark is a person, an event, a circumstance, etc. So I think that what you're doing is that you're offering us, if I can speak to you, John, an invitation to think differently, to talk differently, to respond differently, and in other words, to be different, and to be more of a human being, or to be more of a good human being than perhaps we might have been before, and to be thoughtful and careful about that. And I think it takes practice, that we can practice and practice and practice. However, practice is performing, and no one performance is like another. I think that I know I've heard symphony conductors talk about this in the past, that you can practice and practice and practice with an orchestra, but once you begin the performance, it's not the performance that you practiced, because the musicians are in a different place, the conductor's in a different place, and the context with the live audience is very different than all of the practices. So in other words, no matter how much we practice to try to be natural and spontaneous, there's no one way of doing it. The occasion tells us what to do, or as you say, the landmarks for doing this are already there. So I'm so appreciative of what you've written, how you talk, what you've offered us, the challenges, and for the opportunity for me to have this wonderful, rich reading material every time I board an airplane. So, thank you, and thank all of your conversational partners.
John Schotter has spent a lifetime challenging modern psychology and offering alternative thought-provoking ideas. He has, as Tom Anderson might have said, spent a lifetime walking on the edge, teasing the precipice. He has consistently and tenaciously invited us to come to the edge with him and take a look to see and hear the nuances. He calls to us, look at this, notice that, think about it this way, and so on. He doesn't suggest that we let go of differences. Instead, he emphasizes letting go of trying to make rational sense. He emphasizes difference-making inquiries. He speaks of the fragmentation of modern psychology, the competing theories and approaches to human behavior. This makes me think of a fragmentation risk within our or John's community. We cannot change psychology, and we certainly cannot do it alone. If we are to shape a difference in psychology and its future direction, to have difference-making inquiries with ourselves and others, we must heed John's closing words in his new book, Speaking Actually. And I'll read his words. We must relinquish the still, unfulfilled, and as I see it, forever unfulfillable dream of gaining the very general results we desire in our inquiries, and to be content with the limited, partial, and situated results that we can in fact obtain, which in the end will, I believe, perhaps surprisingly, which will turn out to be far greater practical use and value to us, especially if it can contribute, as I have been suggesting in this book, to an ending of the fragmentation of our relations to each other and the discovery of how much we can do together than we can do apart. Thank you, John, and thank you, Gail, for this gathering.